everyone, and welcome back to Picture the Scene podcast, a true crime podcast aiming to put you, the listener, at the scene of a crime. My name is Andrew.
Rachel.
So I need to say up front, today's episode is going to be a heavy one. There are points in this episode where we discuss domestic violence, strangulation, and the death of a partner. We're going to keep it respectful and factual as always. But if this is not for you, please do turn off now. There's no judgment at all. We understand. And aside from that, this one's also a bit different from what we normally do, isn't it, Rach?
Yeah, that's one word for it, bit different. I'm looking forward to running through this kind of like dynamic though and hearing what our listeners think as well.
Yeah, we did this once before for our Patreon listeners and they loved it. So we did it live that time though, didn't we? So hopefully everyone's going to like it this time.
I was scared when we did that live.
It was good though.
It was.
Oh yeah, so usually we tell you a story, we lay out the facts, we give you our thoughts at the end. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to tell you the story together, the bits we agree on at least, and then we're going to split into two. I'm going to take you through one side, and Rachel's going to take you through the other side, and then we're going to have it out, so to speak. No fisticuffs, though, because this case, if we're being honest, it's one where two reasonable people can look at the same evidence and they can come away with completely different conclusions. So the only question I have before we get started is, are you ready for some true crime, Rach?
I'm ready for some true crime, but I also hope that this doesn't affect our friendship.
So before we get into the full story, we want to set the scene a little differently today. We're going to give you the ending first, not because we like giving you spoilers, but because with this one, knowing how it ends will change how you hear everything that came before.
In the early hours of the 7th of December 2014, a man staggered out of a house in Rainhill, Merseyside, clutching his back. He collapsed against parked cars and crawled to a neighbour's door. He knocked, he fell. Inside that same house, a woman was on the phone to the emergency services. She was crying, hysterical. She'd said she'd stabbed her partner. She said he gripped her by the throat. She said she didn't mean to do it. David Butterworth was 38 years old. He died in hospital at 8:45 that morning. Amanda O'Shaughnessy was 29. She was a mother of 3. And she had been with David for 4 years. A jury convicted her of murder, 10 votes to 2. And in February of this year, the Court of Appeal upheld that conviction. But not everyone agrees that justice was done. And that's what today's about. Was Amanda O'Shaughnessy a murderer? Or was she a survivor? By the end of this, I'm not sure you'll know, and we're not sure we'll know either.
So, if it's safe for you to do so, we'd like you to sit back, relax, close your eyes, and picture the scene. It's the evening of Saturday, the 6th of December, 2014, in Rainhill, a small town in Merseyside. It's sandwiched between St Helens and Liverpool. Now, Rainhill isn't rough, but it isn't posh either. It's somewhere in between. It's the kind of place where people have lived for years, where houses are semi-detached, with driveways and a small front garden. We'd nod to your neighbour on the way to the car and then nod back. You know, it's quiet, it's settled, it's ordinary. Now, the temperature that evening was hovering around 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's properly cold, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers if you're outside for more than a few minutes. It was dry, but the air had a damp December chill to it. The type where you can see your breath hanging in front of you and you pull your coat a little bit tighter without thinking about it. Now, it would have been dark by 4:30 in the afternoon, the streetlights on by 5, and by the time we're picking up this story late in the evening, the whole street would have had that familiar winter look. Curtains drawn, the flicker of television light coming through front windows, and the odd car pulling into a driveway. Behind one of those sets of drawn curtains lived Amanda O'Shaughnessy and David Butterworth, along with their young daughter and Amanda's 2 older girls from previous relationships. So 3 children, all under one roof.
So let's talk about who these 2 people were. Because in a case like this, the people matter as much as the events. As I've mentioned, David Butterworth was 38 years old. He was a precision engineer by trade, a skilled man, someone who worked with his hands, and he was good at it. But by the time we get to December 2014, he'd actually lost his job, and it wasn't the first time. 2 separate companies that he'd worked for had actually gone under during his relationship with Amanda. By the summer of 2014, he was unemployed. He was struggling with depression, and he was drinking heavily. His GP records from June of that year recorded him consuming 63 units of alcohol a week. Just to put that into perspective, the NHS recommended weekly limit is 14 units. So he was drinking more than 4 times what is considered safe. every single week. That said, and this part's important because we're trying to be fair to both sides here, the pathologist who later examined David's body found no physiological signs of heavy alcohol use. So whilst that GP record paints one picture, his body told a slightly different story. Make of that what you will. Amanda was also drinking to excess quite regularly, and that's not disputed by anyone. So both of them had a problem with alcohol. And by all accounts, alcohol was a significant factor in the arguments between them.
So Amanda was 29 years old. She'd had, and there's no gentle way to say this at all, an incredibly difficult life. She grew up in the care of social services, and there are nearly 900 pages of records covering her childhood and adolescence up to the age of 16. And those records describe physical abuse, emotional abuse, and a stepfather who was charged with assault for choking her. And we're going to come back to that history later because it becomes central to the legal arguments. But for now, just know that by the time Amanda met David in 2010, she'd already been through 2 previous long-term relationships, and both of those relationships involved physical violence, including being grabbed by the throat. So that's who we have. A man who was struggling, unemployed, drinking too much, and a woman with a history of trauma, abuse, and volatile relationships. They got together in 2010. David moved into Amanda's home, and they had a daughter together. By all accounts, the relationship was rocky from the start. Friends, relatives, and neighbours all gave evidence at trial of hearing arguments, of being told about disagreements, and of noticing marks or injuries on both of them at various times. Now, the police were called to the home on 8 separate occasions between December 2010 and the night David died. 8 times in 4 years, Rach.
Yeah, and you just don't realise, I guess, in those situations how much people are witnessing and taking record of things. Oh, they argue a lot. I heard this, I heard that. That must be hard to come to terms with, that, other people, just because your front door's closed and your curtains are drawn, everyone is still very aware of what's going on, seeing police cars turn up. Now, one of those 8 occasions is really important, and it happened just weeks before the fatal night, so I'm just going to take you through that now. On the 17th of October 2014, so less than 2 months before David's death, the police were called to the house. When PC Oakley arrived, he found David outside. He had a small scratch on the back of his head, and he smelled of drink, and his eyes were glazed. He was clearly intoxicated. Amanda told the officer that there'd been an argument and that David had grabbed her by the throat at arm's length. She had said she'd struck him on the head with the car keys because she was scared. PC Oakley looked at Amanda and recorded what he saw: antral reddening around her neck and what appeared to be grab marks on her upper arms. David was arrested, but he was so drunk that the custody sergeant had to delay reading him his rights until he was sober enough to understand them. When he was eventually interviewed, he had said Amanda had been in a bad mood and was on her 2nd bottle of wine and had picked an argument. He said she'd slapped him, and so he'd put his hands up in self-defense. If he'd injured her, he accepted he may have done, but it was in self-defense. He said he'd stormed out and felt a blow on the back of his head as he did. David was not charged with any offence. No protection order was put in place. No ongoing support was offered to Amanda, and David went back to that house. The relationship, by everyone's account, got worse after that night, not better.
To imagine it can get worse than that, but it seems like it did. So now let's get to the night itself, the 6th of December 2014. David had been drinking whiskey for most of the day, and late that evening, an argument broke out between them. Now, Amanda recorded approximately 30 minutes of it on her iPhone. She said that she'd wanted to play it back to him the next day to prove that it was all his fault. And then we're going to come back to what's on that recording later, because it matters a lot depending on which side you're looking at this from. So the argument that they had ran from roughly 11:15 until 11:15 that night. Both of them were shouting and swearing at each other, and at 11:15, one of the children came downstairs, and at that point, Amanda just told David to get out, and he did. He left the house. Out of CCTV, picked him up, heading towards the local shops. Then he came back carrying a white carrier bag with crisps and tobacco in it at around 11:52 that evening. And then he got in his car, apparently planning to sleep there. Now, meanwhile, Amanda was inside. She was on the sofa with a laptop, a bottle of wine, and a glass. And at around 11:40, she called her mother and told her that David kicked off again and gone to his car. She told her mum that she was going to ask him to come back inside because it was freezing outside and he had a chest infection. And the phone call to her mother lasted just under an hour.
Now, at some point after 12:45, which is the last time Amanda was seen in the lounge on her home CCTV, so like home camera recording, she went out to the car to tell David to come back in. Nobody disputes that she did this, but what happened after he came back inside, in the kitchen, is where everything falls apart. Nobody else was in that room. There's no recording, there's no home CCTV in the kitchen, no witnesses. Just two people, one of whom is now dead, and the other is serving life for his murder. Now, what we do know is this. At 1:08 a.m., CCTV captured David outside the house clutching his back. He was leaning on parked cars. He fell to the ground. He managed to drag himself to a neighbour's front door. He then knocked and collapsed. The neighbour called the emergency services. Just 1 minute after this is captured on CCTV, at 1:09 a.m., Amanda, who was still inside her home, calls 999. She was distressed, hysterical. She told the operator she had stabbed her partner. She said he had gripped her by the throat. She said she'd got a knife and stabbed him. When the operator asked why, she said because he had endangered her life. She said she didn't know she'd stabbed him until she saw the blood. She said she didn't mean to do it. CCTV then captures Amanda leaving her house at 1:14 a.m., approximately 6 minutes after David was first seen outside. A neighbour heard her shout, "Dave, come back." And then, "I found him. I stabbed him. I didn't mean to do it." She arrived at the neighbour's house where David had collapsed and helped tend to him until the paramedics arrived.
So David Butterworth had a single stab wound to the right side of his lower back. A sharp carving knife from the kitchen block had entered under his ninth rib and penetrated to a depth of just under 6 inches, in the lower part of his right lung and continuing through the abdominal cavity to penetrate his liver. Now, he was rushed to hospital and underwent emergency surgery, but his condition deteriorated and he was pronounced dead at 8:45 that morning. Now, Amanda was examined by a doctor in custody. She told the doctor she'd drunk a bottle of Lambrini in a period from around 10 p.m. to the time of her arrest. She was showing some signs of alcohol intoxication. The doctor found 4 red marks or abrasions of varying lengths on the front of her neck and concluded that they could be consistent with her being held by the front of her neck. She was also examined by a psychiatrist, Dr. Holmes, who found that she was exhibiting significant mental health symptoms indicative of moderate to severe depressive illness. Now, David Butterworth was dead. Amanda O'Shaughnessy was in custody. 3 children no longer had her family intact, and the question of why she happened in that kitchen in the early hours of the 7th of December 2014 is a question that has haunted this case ever since. So what do you think so far, Rach, before we split?
If I'm being honest, I struggle at this stage, given what we've heard and what we know, as to why she is in prison serving a life sentence for murder, but also incredibly frustrated in the build-up to this just weeks before. Easy for me to say at this point, frustrated that David was allowed back to that house where they were clearly both in danger, like on both sides. You know, there's significant damage, if you like, to both individuals where, you know, hurt's been caused. So this could have been avoided, as is, you know, the conclusion with most of our cases.
Don't think I can disagree with anything you've said there, Rach. Right, so this is where we split, and I'm going to take you through the case against Amanda. Why the prosecution argued this was murder, why 10 members of a jury agreed with them, and why this year the Court of Appeal looked at it again and said the conviction stands. Now, Rach is going to come out from the other side after I'm done. And I want to be crystal clear with everyone. I'm not saying I believe every word of this. I'm just laying out the case as the prosecution presented it so you can make up your own mind. So I'm going to start with that recording. You remember she recorded roughly 30 minutes of the argument that evening on her iPhone. Now, she says she did it because she wanted to play it back to David the next day to prove the argument was all his fault. Now, the prosecution played that tape to the jury, and what the jury heard would really tell him. Now, on that recording, Amanda was the one making the threats of violence. Amanda was the one who appeared to be goading David into a confrontation. She was the aggressor in the argument, verbally at least. Now, at one point, David could be heard saying, clearly and without being challenged back by Amanda, that he was not a violent person, that he hated confrontation and animosity. Now, she didn't dispute that. She didn't come back at him and say, what about all the times that you've hurt me? He just simply let it go. Now, the prosecution asked the jury a simple question. If this man had been attacking you, choking you just weeks earlier, which is what Amanda claims, why would you spend 30 minutes trying to provoke him into a fight? Why, when he left the house and got into his car, would you not just lock the door and be done with it? Why would you go back out into the cold and invite him back in? Now, there's something else that the prosecution pointed to on that recording. There were strong suggestions from David during the argument that Amanda was a controlling partner in the relationship, that she would phone him constantly while he was at work and verbally abuse him. Now, the prosecution's argument was that the tape painted a very different picture from the one Amanda was presenting to the jury. So what do you make of that so far, Rach, just on that one recording alone?
Well, I'm a bit angry at that content, and I'll try and lay my facts out really briefly. First of all, if you know you're being recorded, you're gonna, play a role. Yeah, you're not gonna let your true colours out in those moments, in my opinion. Drunk or not, you're gonna be very conscious, especially if you are controlling somebody in those kind of situations. You're going to start playing the victim, and potentially that's why Amanda doesn't refute anything. She's well aware of that and possibly realizes that it's not going to work if he knows he's being recorded. So she's kind of giving up, and that's why she's not arguing back. Second of all, Amanda wasn't just claiming that the man had been attacking her. It was recorded by the PC, the officer that turned up at the house, PC Oakley, that she had marks around her neck. So that's not a claim that the prosecution can say. That's a fact at that point. And third of all, I just want to say, you can say what you want about the claims that Amanda calls him and verbally abuses him. Is there text message evidence? Like, as far as I'm aware, in court, you can't, or you shouldn't be painting a picture of someone without the evidence to back it up. The shoes on the other foot, like, they can't go back and hear recorded telephone conversations unless David has kept a log of them. So, saying stuff like that in court and making her out to not be a victim, just to me, is really nasty.
So yeah, I know, I get what you're saying, and we're going to get to your side, but just like, we don't know that David knew he was being recorded. We do know that Amanda knew that she was being recorded, yet she was still being the aggressor. And we do know that David said this to her and she didn't dispute it on the call. But I see what you're saying, and we will get to your side. Let's carry on for now. So let's talk about that wound itself, because this was also a big part of the prosecution's case. David was stabbed once in the right side of his lower back. The knife went in horizontally, slightly inwards and downwards. Now, Amanda's account was that they were face to face when it happened. She said David had pinned her against the kitchen counter. He had his hand around her throat, his head pushed back, her left hand trapped behind her. She said that she reached over her shoulder with her right hand, grabbing the first thing that she could, and swung it at him in a kind of bear hug motion. Now, she didn't even know it was a knife, she said, until she saw blood. Now, the pathologist, Dr. Johnson, was asked whether the wound could have been inflicted in the way that Amanda describes. His answer was that if they were face to face and close together, it was possible, but difficult. The further apart they were standing, the more difficult it became, and if there was any real gap between them, it would have been virtually impossible. So the Court of Appeal in 2020 went a little bit further. They described her account of how the wound ended up where it did as completely implausible. They pointed out that if she had grabbed something from behind her, over her shoulder, while being choked at close quarters, the natural place to strike would have been the upper back, the neck, or the shoulder. The idea that she would have leaned around his left arm, which she said was gripping her throat, with her head pushed back to hit him on the other side of his body in a kind of bear hug, when she would have hit him far more easily in places directly behind him, made no sense at all. And there's a small detail that supported this. The bottles and the glass that were sitting next to the knife block on the work surface were undisturbed. if there had been a violent struggle at that counter with Amanda pinned against it and reaching behind her in desperation, you'd expect something to be knocked over, but nothing was. So now let me talk about that scene. When the crime scene investigators went into the kitchen, David's mobile phone was on the floor by the bin with the screen smashed. Amanda denied throwing it. She couldn't explain how it got there. A white carrier bag with crisps and tobacco were also on the floor by a chair. Now, that same bag David had been seen on CCTV, remember, carrying back from the shops. And the prosecution said that they showed David had come into the kitchen with the bag, meaning they were together in that room, and that it was after that she'd brought him back in from the car. And then there's the timing, which bothered the jury. At 1:08 a.m., CCTV showed David outside, gravely injured, clutching his back. Amanda called 999 at 1:09. 1 minute later, she was still inside the house when she made that call. She didn't go outside until 1:14. That's 6 minutes after David was already dying on the street. The 999 call itself lasted just over 4 minutes, so most of that gap is accounted for. But the prosecution invited the jury to ask themselves why. If you just stabbed someone in self-defense and were genuinely frightened and concerned, you didn't immediately run outside after him.
Well, can I just maybe give an idea that she was scared that he might come back? At that point, she doesn't know that he's gone over the road to the neighbours. He could be. She doesn't know. Well, yes, I appreciate that she's conscious he's gravely injured because there's blood on her and on the knife. And, so there's a trail of blood that she's thinking, God, I've hurt him. Hence why she's called 999 and then spent 4 minutes on the phone with them. But then there's, coming off the phone and being like, what if he comes back for round 2? I can only imagine, having never been in a scenario like this myself, that your mind is racing and, you're not really in a place to think rationally. And obviously her rational thoughts come round to, oh my God, is he okay? And, then 2 minutes later going out to find him.
Fair enough, Shot. I can see that point of view, but there was also a witness, John Mills, who was David's close friend. David used to go and stay at John's house after arguments with Amanda. Now, John gave evidence at trial that just weeks before the stabbing, Amanda had told him that she had gone for David after he pushed her away, and that, in her own words, David had never been violent towards her. Amanda denied the conversation ever took place, but the jury heard it, and it directly contradicted the picture she was painting of David as a violent one. So here's where the prosecution landed, and where 10 members of that jury followed them. They said that Amanda O'Shaughnessy stabbed David Butterworth in the back as he was walking away from her, not face to face, not pinned against the counter, not in self-defense. She stabbed him from behind, intending at minimum to cause him serious harm. The recording showed her as the aggressor. The wound was in his back. The pathology just didn't support her account. Now, John Mills's evidence contradicted her, and a jury, 10 of them, said murder. So she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. The jury also rejected the partial defense of loss of control, which, by the way, the judge had left them of his own initiative. Even though Amanda's own legal team hadn't run it as a defense, he had left it to them that they could go with that defense if they wanted to. The judge directed them carefully on it. He explained it properly, and they rejected it. They were sure that they were either sure that she didn't lose control, or sure that any loss of control wasn't triggered by a fear of serious violence, or sure that a reasonable person in her position would not have lost control and stabbed him. However they got there, they did get there. And in 2026, 3 appeal court judges, led by Lady Justice Andrews, looked at the whole thing again and said the conviction was safe. So that is a prosecution case, Rach. What have you got for us?
Okay, my turn. And I just want to say up front, just like Andy did, I'm not saying that I know what happened in that kitchen. Nobody does. But I do think there are things that this case missed. There are things that the jury never heard. And there are things that the legal system still struggles with when a woman kills a man who has been hurting her. So let me take you through it. Let me start with who Amanda O'Shaughnessy was before she met David Butterworth, because I think that matters more than anything else in this case. So Amanda grew up in the care of social services. As Andrew's already noted, there are nearly 900 pages of records covering her life up to the age of 16. Those records describe a childhood that was, and I'm not being dramatic here, horrific. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, excessive physical punishment, not just from her stepfather, but from her mother as well. Her stepfather was actually charged with assault for choking her. He would hit the children for the slightest thing. When she was a child, he made her draw pictures of penises. And when she was in her early teens, she would sometimes wake up on the sofa to find his hands up her back and sides. He would claim he was trying to calm her down. None of this was put before the jury. Those 900 pages of records were never obtained by her legal team before the trial. The jury decided her fate without any of that information. And then after age 16, we go on to her relationships. Amanda had 3 significant romantic relationships in her adult life before the age of 29. Every single one of them involved physical violence. Every single one of them involved someone putting their hands around her throat. Her first partner grabbed her by the throat while she was holding their baby in her arms. He also forced her to have an abortion. Her second partner had serious mental health problems. He hit her in the face with a bag of cans while she was pregnant with their child. On one occasion, he grabbed her by the throat and held her against a wall. And then there was David. By the time Amanda met David in 2010, she'd spent her entire life, from childhood through to adulthood, surrounded by violence. Throat grabbing wasn't something that happened to her once. It was a pattern. It was a thing that kept happening to her over and over again from different people across different stages of her life. Her stepfather, her first partner, her second partner, and now David. I think this matters. I think it matters enormously. And the jury didn't know any of it beyond what Amanda herself told them. Just about David, though.
I think just to be on the prosecution side here, for the sake of this episode, I think that she had the chance to say that, but also these records, all of this was considered by the Court of Appeal, and yet her conviction still stood as safe.
And that's concerning. But let me tell you what's happened since the trial. So after her conviction, Amanda's new legal team, instructed by Professor Andrew Forrester, a consultant forensic psychiatrist from Cardiff University, to assess her. His conclusion was that Amanda was suffering from PTSD and complex PTSD at the time of the killing. Now, complex PTSD, this has only become a recognised diagnosis since 2022. It arises from repeatedly experienced trauma, things like ongoing neglect, violence, and sexual abuse, rather from one single traumatic event. It can develop over years, and the symptoms are similar to standard PTSD, but can also include shame, guilt, difficulty in relationships, disassociation, and destructive or risky behaviour. Professor Forrester's opinion was that any physical violence, sexual assault, or threats to kill made by David would have made those conditions worse, because they would have caused Amanda to re-experience that trauma similar to what she'd been through before. The anxiety, the hypervigilance, the fear, all of it would have been intensified. And crucially, he said that her experience of fear, including fear of serious violence, would have been felt with greater intensity and speed than it would by someone who hadn't lived through what she had. Now here's the part I really want people to hear. The prosecution instructed their own expert, Dr. Cumming, a consultant forensic psychiatrist, and he agreed. He agreed with Professor Forrester's diagnosis. Both experts signed a joint statement that said Amanda's perception of threat from David was elevated by her PTSD and complex PTSD, and that this may allow a defense of loss of control. The prosecution's own expert agreed she was a trauma survivor whose fear response was heightened. Just let that sit for a moment.
No, that does sound quite compelling, but I think what we have to focus on here is the words may and could. And also we have to think about the fact that there was evidence that from the weeks before in October, I think it was, that she attacked him as he was walking away, as he was no longer a threat. And this feels like a repetition of what she's done before. So even though her fear response may have been heightened, it's hard to argue that she was in fear of danger of serious violence when he was already walking away.
That's what he said, and it's a classic he said, she said situation. But let me go back to that night in October 2014, the incident, because I covered the facts earlier, but I want to make a point about what happened after it. So on the 17th of October, the police came to the house. PC Oakley saw substantial reddening around Amanda's neck and what appeared to be grab marks on her upper arms. Those injuries were consistent with being grabbed by the throat. David was arrested. He was so drunk, the custody sergeant couldn't even read him his rights straight away. And then what happened? He was not charged. Amanda received no protection order. There was no ongoing support. There was no safety plan. And he went back to the house. And 6 weeks later, he's dead. I'm not saying the police are responsible for what happened. But what I am saying is that when the system has a woman standing in front of an officer with grab marks on her neck and reddening around her throat, and the response is to arrest that man, but then release him and send him home, that's a failure. That is not the system protecting someone it should be protecting. And let me talk about the marks on Amanda's neck on the night David died. Because again, this is physical evidence, not just her word. She's examined in the hospital by a doctor in custody. The doctor found 4 red marks and abrasions of varying lengths on the front of her neck. The doctor's conclusion was that they could be consistent with her being held to the front of the neck. That's not Amanda saying she was choked. That's a medical professional examining her body and finding marks consistent with her account. And the jury heard about those marks. But what they didn't hear was that they never had a chance, and what they didn't have a chance to weigh up was the lifetime of context that explained why a woman with those marks on her neck might just react the way Amanda did. And that brings me to the most important part of it all. The jury made their decision without hearing from a psychiatric expert. They didn't hear about PTSD. They didn't hear about complex PTSD. Now, obviously, that wasn't around when this case went to trial, but they didn't see the 900 pages of social services records that were available. They didn't hear that every significant relationship in Amanda's life had involved someone putting their hands around her throat. They decided her fate without any of that evidence. It's not like nobody thought of it, though, because before the trial, junior counsel specifically advised that an expert psychologist should be instructed to consider whether Amanda's history of abuse could have resulted in battered women syndrome or a similar diagnosed condition. Junior counsel also advised that social services records should be obtained for reasons that can no longer be established because the leading counsel who made the tactical decisions have since retired and the files are gone. This advice was never acted on, though. The social services records were never obtained. There was no application made to the court for more time to get them. And it just feels like she was failed again and again and again. Failed by the police, failed by our own defense team, failed by the courts. Now, the Court of Appeal said in 2026 that the tactical decisions made by her trial lawyers were reasonable and justifiable. They said the original expert evidence didn't support running a mental health defense, and they said the defense of loss of control would have undermined Amanda's primary defense of self-defense. And legally, they may be right about that. But the fact remains that a woman with a lifetime of documented trauma, whose own legal team's junior counsel flagged the need for exactly the kind of evidence that 2 experts have now agreed supports a defense, went to trial without any of it being put before the jury. And I just don't think you can shrug that off. The Centre for Women's Justice, which supports Amanda's appeal, argues that this case reflects a wider pattern. Women who kill in the context of domestic abuse are still routinely convicted of murder rather than manslaughter, or denied self-defense because the legal system is built around a model of violence that doesn't account for cumulative trauma, for hypervigilance, for the way that fear works differently in a body that has been repeatedly hurt. And I think the question I can't stop coming back to is this. If you have spent your entire life being choked by your stepfather, by your first partner, by your second partner, and then by your current partner, and then one night after an argument, he comes back into the kitchen, he puts his hands around your throat again, would you react and be calm and measured? Or would your body do what it's learnt to do to survive? Because that's what PTSD does. And that's what the complex PTSD does. You act before you think. Your body responds to the threat based on everything it has been through, not just what's happening in that moment. And then afterwards, you describe it in the only framework that makes sense to you. I was defending myself. I reached for something. I didn't mean to do it. The experts say that doesn't mean she chose it, and the jury never got to hear that. And I feel like, just one final point, obviously, the prosecution had an expert come in and say that the scene did not match the way that she'd have struggled and stabbed David. But again, in these moments, the body reacts in strange ways. People can bend and break in a survival mode to get what they need to get done. So I can't imagine that there's ever a perfect crime scene that ticks all the boxes of what the prosecution or what the defense suggests should be given. But I feel like I went on a bit of a rant there. Sorry. But that's my side, Andy. So I will give you some time to let us know what you think.
Well, it's very interesting, which is why this is a difficult case, and two people next to each other, like we said at the beginning, can come to totally different reasons for this. You're right, no crime scene is ever perfect. However, you have to go on probability, and the probability that she would have stabbed him like that is very, very low. And also, yes, you have the manslaughter thing, which is a valid argument. The Centre for Women's Justice is, generally speaking, when they talk about women who are convicted of murder for domestic violence, in response to domestic violence, it's far too often that murder is considered without even manslaughter. And I agree with them that it should be, but that doesn't mean that it should be in every single case. Now, also, yeah, it's just a tough one. And I think I'm going to tell you where I land, where the prosecution lands. The jury heard that recording. They heard David say that he wasn't a violent person. They heard Amanda making threats. They heard John Mills say she told him David had never been violent towards her. They looked at the pathology evidence, a wound in the back that didn't match her account. And by the way, we say yes, maybe her defense counsel failed her, but they would have put this to her, and if she was insistent and saying this was self-defense, they wouldn't be able to go with the defense of loss of control because it contradicts it. They have to go with what their client instructs that they want to go with. And 10 of 12 people said murder. Now that matters, Rach, because that's not one person's opinion. It's 10 people who sat through every piece of evidence that they had and came to the same conclusion.
Now, I appreciate this is 2014. Ever heard of gaslighting? He could, in this coercive controlling relationship, could have caught wind that John had heard Amanda talking about hurting him, and he's sent Amanda around to deny that he's ever put his hands on it, and she's probably in a panic gone, I never said that to him, because obviously it does challenge her case, but she is in a potentially coercive controlling relationship. So yeah, it doesn't wash with me. But I will just argue 10 people never heard about 900 pages of social services files up to the age of 16. 10 people didn't know that every significant partner she'd ever had put their hands around her throat, and 10 people who never heard the words PTSD or complex PTSD, and decisions were made without all the evidence that they can't be fully trusted.
But the Court of Appeal did look at that exact argument in 2026 and said the evidence could have been available at trial. Her own lawyers made a tactical choice not to run it. And the court said that those decisions were reasonable and justifiable. You can't blame the justice system for every tactical call made by defense counsel.
One of her lawyers specifically advised getting those social services records and instructing a psychologist on battered women syndrome, though, and that advice was ignored. And unfortunately, we'll never know why, because the leading counsel is retired. As I've said, the files are just gone. But that's not a tactical choice anyone can defend when no one can explain why it was made. So I just don't get why the Court of Appeal have gone down that route.
Because they can't assume that advice was ignored. You can't assume, just because someone recommends it, you can't assume that then the senior counsel didn't go to Amanda and say this. You can't assume it could have been ignored. But you've also got Amanda herself, not once, not on the 999 call, not in her police interview, not in the witness box, did she ever say that she lost control. She said that it was self-defense, deliberate. She demonstrated reaching over her shoulder. She described grabbing something to hit him with to get him off her. Now, that's not someone describing a trauma response. That's someone describing a calculated act, which the pathologist said was highly unlikely could have happened.
That's exactly how PTSD and complex PTSD can work, though. That's exactly what the experts are saying. You act, your body does not. Your body does what it has learnt to do to survive, and then afterwards, you describe it in the only way that makes sense to you. I was defending myself. The experts both agreed the perception of threat was heightened. The prosecution's own expert agreed that. That doesn't mean she chose what happened in that kitchen. That therefore means that it was not a calculated act.
Both of those experts, Rach, the same two experts that you keep coming back to, they also said that the conviction might be still safe even with all that evidence. The prosecution's own expert said that it may allow a loss of control defense. May allow. Not would, not should, may. And the Court of Appeal just wasn't persuaded. And neither were the original jury when the judge left loss of control to them. You have to remember also that the judge took time out to, in detail, describe what loss of control was, that they could, even though the defense wasn't arguing for this, they could still go with loss of control as a defense and find her not guilty of murder. The judge took time, and that isn't being argued at the original trial of his own accord to describe this to the jury.
I just think there's enough reasonable doubt there. You said yourself, experts said they might still be safe, the conviction. Might, again. There's doubt there. It could go either way. The jury who rejected loss of control didn't have the psychiatric evidence explaining why she might have lost control, and that's a problem for me. They were asked to consider it in a vacuum. And I keep thinking there's other cases like this. A case that comes to mind is about Sally Challen, because it's the same story. Sally killed her husband with a hammer after nearly 40 years of psychological abuse and coercive control. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 22 years. Luckily, in 2019, the Court of Appeal quashed her conviction because of fresh psychiatric evidence that had been presented at trial. That hadn't been presented at trial. A diagnosis that changed how the court understood what happened, and she was able to walk free on a manslaughter plea. The system got it wrong the first time with Challen. How do we not know they haven't got it wrong here?
It's because the legal details matter, Rach. In Challen, the psychiatric evidence specifically supported diminished responsibility. There were concrete diagnoses of bipolar affective disorder and borderline personality disorder that changed the legal picture. In Amanda's case, neither expert went that far. Professor Forrester's evidence doesn't give Amanda a defense on its own. The Court of Appeal was clear about that. And we have to think about Emma Jane Magson. If you don't know her, give her a Google, listeners. She ran almost the same argument as Amanda. She stabbed her partner with a kitchen knife in self-defense, that he'd pinned her by the neck, and the Court of Appeal rejected her appeal twice, not once, twice. So these cases, sadly, don't always go the way that media campaigns want them to go. Just because there's a campaign doesn't mean that that is what should happen.
And I accept that. And I'm not saying the law is simple or that every woman who kills her partner was justified, but I think there's something wrong when the prosecution's own psychiatrist agrees a woman who had PTSD and complex PTSD agrees her fear response was heightened by a lifetime of trauma, and the system still says that doesn't matter, the conviction stands. And I think David deserves acknowledgement too. He was somebody's son. He was clearly struggling. He'd lost his job. He was drinking too much. He's not just a villain in this story, but Amanda can't be seen as a villain, and the truth is probably more complicated than either side finds comfortable. It's sad because there'll be other women in these situations who lose hope when cases like this are so heavily publicised in the man's favour.
I understand what you're saying there, and I'm going to give you an honest closing from the prosecution's perspective on this. Amanda O'Shaughnessy had a trial. She had a judge. She had a jury. She had an experienced defence counsel who had done this many, many times before. The jury heard a recording of her voice. They heard a pathologist. They heard a witness who contradicted her account. 10 of them made a decision. Court of Appeal examined it carefully, and 3 senior judges agreed the conviction was safe. Now, the legal system isn't perfect, but when 10 jurors and 3 appeal judges all look at the same case and reach the same conclusion, I think you just have to respect that, even if it's really uncomfortable.
Okay, but here's mine. We now know that Amanda had PTSD and complex PTSD. We now know that the jury never heard that, and we know her whole life was a preparation for that moment in that kitchen, building from her stepfather, her first partner, her second partner, and then David. We know she had marks on her neck, consistent with being choked. We know the law around coercive control and trauma has moved on quite a bit in her favour since her trial. And the question I can't let go of is this. If her trial happened today, with everything we now know, with the psychiatric evidence, with the social services records, with 2 experts agreeing her fear response was elevated, would it end the same way? Well, honest answer is I don't know. But I think the fact that I don't know is also the problem.
I think we can both agree on that one. But Amanda O'Shaughnessy is serving a life sentence. Based on a minimum term of 14 years, she will be eligible for parole consideration in 2029.
And David Butterworth's family have not commented publicly on the appeal proceedings. The Centre for Women's Justice and the Justice for Women continue to campaign on cases of women who kill in the context of domestic abuse.
So if you have any views on today's episode, we'd love to hear them. Come find us on social media. And as always, or leave us a comment on Spotify. And as always, please do rate and review wherever you listen.
And finally, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse or coercive control, support is available through the National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the UK. The number is 0808 2000 247. It's free, it's confidential, and it's available 24 hours a day.
So I'm going to wrap up here. So if it's safe for you to do so, I'd like to sit back, relax, close your eyes and picture the scene. Whether you think the law has got this right or whether you think it got it badly wrong, this case does ask something important about what we owe to victims and which victims we actually see. So that's thank you all from me.
And from me. And Andy, I hope we're friends again.
Oh, we are, yes.
But we'll speak to you all soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye.